"You'll never be part of this family, Marion." "Not really." She said it the day we lowered my husband's ashes into the earth, her voice calm, her smile sharp as frost. I only nodded, because truth has a longer memory than cruelty. If you're listening, subscribe and tell me where you're from. Some walls crumble without a single blow. My name is Marion Holloway, and I am 63 years old. I live in a cedar-sided house above the bay in Port Orchard, Washington. On clear evenings, I can see ferries drift past like patient sheep. I worked 35 years as a librarian, and silence still feels like home. I met Thomas Holloway at a book sale when I was 47. He asked if I liked history more than hope, and I laughed. He built this house with his own hands before we married. He said, "A home should hold room for rain and forgiveness." I believed him, because he always kept promises quietly. We were not young when we married, but we were steady. Thomas had a daughter, Ellen, who carried his intelligence without his gentleness. She kept her mother's last name joined with his, proud and precise. After our small backyard wedding, she shook my hand like a stranger. "My father is sentimental," she said once, smiling without warmth. "He forgets that families are facts," I answered softly. "Facts live longer when they are kind." She married David Frost, a competent lawyer who spoke in tidy sentences. He called me Marion from the start, never mom or even stepmom. I did not ask for more than respect. I only wanted peace at the table and patience in the hall. Life with Thomas was ordinary in a sacred way. We labeled jars, sorted screws in coffee tins, and read in the same chair by turns. He mended the squeak in the back door every spring, then let it return by fall. "Houses like to talk," he said, smiling. On Sundays, we packed thermoses and watched the water from the bluff. He wore a wool cap and kept lists on yellow paper. When he had a stroke last winter, the cap hung on its peg for weeks. The house held its breath until I learned how to breathe for both of us. "You still belong," I told myself each morning, steady and plain. The month after the funeral, Ellen began to visit with folders. She stood in my kitchen as if it were a waiting room. "Dad would want order," she said, placing forms beside the bread box. "The house is a Holloway asset." I poured tea and kept my voice calm. "Thomas gave me a key with his promise," I answered. "I promised to keep the lights warm." She glanced toward the mantel where his cap still rested. "No one is taking your memories," she said. "Only clarifying ownership." The words felt clean and cold, like rain on glass. I smiled, because librarians learn how to read between lines. I kept the house mostly as Thomas left it. His hammer hung above the workbench, and his yellow lists sat in a drawer. I wore his watch when I gardened, so time would not slip. I called my sister, Grace Keller, when the nights stretched long. "Come over," she said. "I will bring pie and a good story." Grace lives 2 streets away, and her laughter can fix a day. She never liked Ellen's careful smile, but she never said unkind things. "Hold your ground kindly," she advised. "Kindness with offense still counts as kindness." I wrote that in a small notebook I kept by the phone. The house itself carries our history in modest ways. The dining table has a ring where Thomas once set a hot kettle. The hallway paint hides a pencil mark from the day we measured our hopes. In summer, the bay wind sneaks under the door and smells like salt and cedar. I talk to the wind sometimes and to the framed photo of Thomas. "We are all right," I say, touching the glass. "I am keeping the lists. When I miss him most, I read the notes he left inside cookbooks. One says, 'Marion likes nutmeg, add more than the recipe.' I do, and the kitchen feels friendly again." I kept expecting time to soften Ellen's edges. It did not. She called when she needed dates, numbers, or keys. She did not call for soup or stories or weather. When we met in town, she introduced me by name only. I reminded myself that grief can turn people into locked rooms. I knew I could not pick her lock with perfect behavior. I could only be present, consistent, and unwilling to vanish. "You belong where you stand, faithful," Grace told me. I believed her, because she has watched me bend without breaking for years. When the letter from Ellen's attorney arrived, it sat like a stone in my mailbox. The envelope was polite, the font professional, and the message clear. It requested that I vacate the home within 60 days for asset realignment. I read it twice, then made tea and looked out at the bay. The ferries kept moving, calm and exact. I felt my heart slow to their pace. If you're listening, subscribe and tell me where you're from, I whispered to the empty room. Sometimes witness is the first kindness. I laid the letter beside Thomas's watch and waited for the tide inside me to settle. The letter stayed on the counter for 3 days before I picked it up again. The envelope was thin, yet it seemed to weigh the whole house down. I'd lost Thomas only a month earlier, and grief was still something I wore like a second skin. Now there was another wound, written in polite legal language and signed with my stepdaughter's married name. I finally opened it on a Thursday morning. Per our conversation, it read, "Please vacate the residence within 60 days for asset realignment." The words felt bloodless, as if my life could be folded into a ledger and balanced elsewhere. I reread the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it beside the teapot. Losing a husband was private pain. Losing the home you built with him was public humiliation. That afternoon I called Grace. "Don't get angry," she said. "Get informed." It was her way of telling me that emotion without evidence was wasted effort. I drove to the bank, the same small branch where Thomas and I had opened our joint account 20 years earlier. The teller recognized me. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Holloway," she said softly. I thanked her and asked about our accounts. After a moment at her screen, she frowned. "There was an inquiry on your file last week from Ellen Frost. She used the co-signature authorization your husband added years ago." I felt a strange calm settle over me, like frost forming evenly on glass. "Could you print the record of that access?" I asked. She nodded and handed me a slip of paper. That paper would become my first piece of proof. When I got home, I opened Thomas's old desk drawer. Inside were our insurance statements, neatly bundled with a rubber band. The newest one, dated 6 months before his death, listed me as joint beneficiary, something Ellen likely didn't know. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper and whispered, "You planned for this, didn't you?" The sound of the bay wind against the windows was my only answer. The next morning, I drove to the county office. The clerk, a young man with a polite stutter, brought up the property file. "There's a pending draft here," he said. "Unverified will, filed by Frost and Landon, but not notarized." I stared at the screen. Frost and Landon, David Frost's firm. The signature line for Thomas was blank. I asked for a printed copy. "Of course," he said, and the printer hummed out the evidence of quiet deceit. That night, I placed both documents, the bank slip and the draft will, on the dining table beneath the lamp. The light hit the paper in the same place it used to touch Thomas's newspaper each morning. "I'm still here," I said softly. "They'll learn that belonging isn't something you inherit, it's something you keep." I folded the papers, slid them into a manila envelope, and wrote a single word across the front: proof. The next week became a quiet study in patience. I treated each day like a research shift, steady hours, clear notes, no emotion until the work was done. I pulled Thomas's old accordion file from the closet and spread it across the kitchen table. The smell of paper and dust brought back the rhythm of our evenings together. Him sorting receipts, me reading by the lamp. He'd always say, "Records protect memories." Now I understood what he meant. Grace came over on Tuesday with coffee and her sensible shoes. "Let's start where the truth lives," she said. We opened every envelope, every folder, until the table looked like a small archive. Bank statements confirmed what I already knew: Thomas had added my name to every account after we married. Yet one entry caught my eye. A withdrawal form dated a week after his death, unsigned but marked "Administrative Inquiry." "That's not an accident," Grace said quietly. "They're testing the water." I wrote it down in my notebook, the first of many entries, titled Suspicion. The next morning, I returned to Soundview Bank with my folder. Mr. Kerrigan, the branch manager, met me in his glass-walled office. I told him I needed confirmation of beneficiary status and any recent account activity. He tapped at his keyboard, then looked up. "Yes, Mrs. Holloway. Thomas made changes last March. You're listed as sole beneficiary now. His daughter was removed." I felt the faintest tremor of gratitude, not triumph. He printed the record and handed it to me in a crisp envelope. "Keep this somewhere safe," he advised. I nodded. "Don't worry," I said. "I've started keeping everything safe." After the bank, I stopped at the courthouse to check public filings. The clerk, a woman with ink-stained fingers, found the Frost and Landon document. She frowned as she scanned it. "This draft has no signature and no witness," she said. It's invalid on its face. I asked for a certified copy. She stamped it, sliding it across the counter. I'll keep the original flagged, she added softly, just in case they try again. I thanked her and left, the papers tucked under my arm like armor. That evening, Grace and I sat at my table, sipping tea while the wind rattled the windows. They're not just careless, she said. They're confident. They think you'll tire before the truth does. I smiled faintly. Then I'll let the truth do the tiring. I opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote the words, "Document everything." On Thursday, a manila envelope arrived by mail, another letter from Frost and Landon. Per our previous notice, it began, failure to vacate will necessitate legal enforcement. I set it beside my growing stack. The contrast between their threats and my calm made me think of Thomas fixing that old door hinge, refusing to force the screw. Gentle pressure, he'd say. That's how things hold. Friday brought an unexpected kindness. At the grocery store, I ran into Harold Nguyen, a widower I knew from the temple. He'd once notarized donation forms for me. "You look like a woman who's reading too many contracts," he joked. I laughed despite myself. When I told him what was happening, his smile faded, but his tone stayed steady. "Bring me the papers," he said. "We'll make copies, notarize what matters, and timestamp every truth." His offer wasn't pity, it was respect. I felt stronger walking back to the car than I had in weeks. That night, I placed everything, bank record, draft will, letter, and Grace's notes, into a single binder. On the front, I wrote, "The Belonging Ledger." Each page would hold one simple fact, that dignity, when documented, becomes unshakable. I stacked the binder beside Thomas's old watch on the dresser and whispered, "You built this house for faith, not fear. I'm keeping it that way." When I turned off the lamp, the house felt quieter than usual but not empty. Proof, like prayer, has its own kind of company. Harold arrived 2 mornings later, carrying a briefcase that looked older than both of us. He set it carefully on my table and said, "Let's make order from worry." His voice had that calm steadiness that people who've seen hardship often carry. I poured him coffee and laid out the documents. He adjusted his glasses, reading each page with the patience of a craftsman inspecting fine grain. "These are strong papers," he said finally. "But paper means little without sequence. We'll create a trail even the wind can't scatter." He drew a notepad toward him and began listing steps in neat, square handwriting. "First, notarize every document you have. Bank letters, the insurance notice, property deed, even correspondence. Second, make duplicate copies, one for you, one sealed with me. Third, record an affidavit of your ownership and beneficiary status at the county clerk's office. It's a quiet wall between you and their lawyer." I nodded, writing as he spoke. "And after that?" He smiled slightly. "After that, you go back to living your life while the law does its quiet work." Grace joined us halfway through, carrying her notebook and a tray of scones. "I brought fuel for justice," she announced, setting them down. Harold laughed, folding his hands over the papers. "I like your sister," he said. Grace grinned. "Most people do until I start giving advice." Then, turning to me, she added softly, "You're doing well, Marian. You're not fighting, you're maintaining." I felt the warmth of her words more than the coffee. Harold began stamping each page, his movements deliberate, each press of the notary seal leaving a quiet circle of authority. "You'd be surprised," he said, "how many people lose because they let others define the story. Law listens best to neat handwriting and calm witnesses." When he'd finished, he slid the stack toward me. "Now everything speaks for itself, even if you choose silence." We spent the afternoon driving to the clerk's office. The building smelled faintly of old wood and copier ink. The clerk, a woman my age with kind eyes, reviewed our affidavit and nodded. "This is properly filed," she said. "Once recorded, no claim can override it without your signature." I thanked her, and she handed me the stamped copy. "Guard this," she said. "It's the heartbeat of your case." Back at home, Harold refused my offer of payment. "Your peace of mind is enough," he said. "Besides, the temple owes me karma for all the coffee I drink." Before leaving, he looked around the living room, his gaze lingering on Thomas's cap hanging by the door. "He must have been a patient man," he said quietly. "The kind who built things that last." I nodded. "He was. I intend to be one of them. After he left, Grace stayed a while longer. We sat in companionable silence, watching the light fade across the bay. You know, she said, most people collapse under this kind of pressure. You seem to be getting stronger. I smiled faintly. Maybe it's because I've stopped seeing it as a battle. It's just truth, finally asking to be seen. She reached over, squeezed my hand, and said, "Then let's make sure it's seen beautifully." When she left, I placed the stamped affidavit beside the binder I now called the belonging ledger. The seal shimmered faintly under the lamp. I whispered, "Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Grace. And thank you, Thomas, for teaching me steadiness." The house felt warmer, not because anyone had lit a fire, but because faith had found its paperwork. The pressure came slowly, not as one storm, but as a series of quiet, deliberate gusts. Each arrived disguised as care. A phone call here, a letter there, a polite suggestion wrapped in legal phrasing. That is how people take what isn't theirs politely. It began with a voicemail from Ellen. "Mom," she said, voice clipped but falsely gentle. "I heard you've been talking to outsiders. That's not necessary. We can handle this as family." I replayed it once, then saved it to my binder. Not for revenge, for record. 2 days later, a courier arrived with another envelope from Frost and Landon. The letter used familiar language, almost friendly, but each line carried the same unspoken demand. Step aside. "In light of your recent filings," it said, "we urge you to consider a cooperative settlement." I set it on the counter, beside the fruit bowl, and watched sunlight crawl over the Frost and Landon letterhead. Cooperative, I thought. A word that often means surrender. Over the next 12 days, the rhythm became predictable. 4 calls, 2 visits, 7 messages implying concern. Grace counted them with me like they were calendar days. "It's a campaign," she said, her tone more clinical than angry. "They're trying to exhaust your peace before they challenge your facts." One evening, I was making soup when Robert Frost, Ellen's husband, knocked on my door. His face wore that careful politeness lawyers use before cross-examination. "We should talk," he said. "Ellen's worried about you." I motioned him inside, wiping my hands on a towel. "Tell her I'm fine." He hesitated, then glanced toward the binder on the table. "It's not good to keep stirring this up," he said. "It's just money and paperwork. None of it changes how we feel about you." I smiled faintly. "That's true," I said. "It only shows how you really felt all along." He tried another tactic. "You could move to one of those senior communities, no upkeep, no stress." I poured him a cup of tea instead of an answer. "Do you think peace comes from moving away?" I asked. "Or from standing where you belong?" His eyes lowered, and he didn't reply. When he left, he said softly, "You've got fight in you, Marion." I didn't expect that. "Neither did you want to," I replied. That night, I documented everything in the belonging ledger. I listed dates, times, tones, and phrases. 12 entries in total, the last one ending with a sentence I underlined twice. They are building noise. I am building proof. By the end of the second week, even my neighbors started to notice. One woman from down the lane approached me at the mailbox. "I heard your stepdaughter's thinking of selling the place," she said. "It's such a shame you'll have to leave." Her words were casual, her eyes curious. I smiled, folding my mail slowly. "Rumors travel faster than facts," I said. "But facts are the only ones that arrive." That evening, I met Harold at the temple for tea. "They're testing your patience," he said. "They want you angry, because anger looks unstable in court." "Then I'll stay ordinary," I said. "Ordinary is harder to dismiss." He smiled. "Good. Let them underestimate you. The quiet wins slower but longer." The next morning, the bank manager called. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "someone attempted to place a temporary freeze on your joint account, but the authorization failed." I thanked him, my voice calm though my hands trembled slightly. "Please note that in your report," I said, "and send me a copy." He hesitated. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Yes," I said, and I was. Later that week, Ellen arrived unannounced. She looked tired, like someone who'd been rehearsing her own version of events. "You've turned this into something ugly," she said. "All I wanted was fairness." "Fairness," I repeated, "isn't measured by comfort." She sighed, exasperated. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I already did everything else," I said simply. I kept peace. I stayed silent. I forgave. And still, here we are. She looked at me for a long moment, her face unreadable. You're not even angry, are you? She asked finally. No, I said. Anger belongs to people who think they've lost something. I haven't. When she left, I walked to the bay window and watched her car drive away. The tide was low. The water pulled back far enough to show the rocks beneath. They looked bare, but steady. That night, I lit a single candle in the kitchen and whispered, "Let them come with noise. I'll meet them with light." On the final page of the week's entries, I wrote, "Proof gathered. Boundaries set. They confuse silence for surrender. They'll learn it's the sound of strength waiting." Ellen and David came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of bright cold day that makes even tension look civil. I had called them earlier that week and said simply, "We need to talk about the house." No threats, no anger, just the truth's invitation. Grace and Harold both offered to stay nearby, but I told them no. "This part," I said, "is mine to finish." I prepared the living room carefully that morning. The table was cleared except for 3 folders, each labeled in calm, black ink. The kettle was warm, the air faintly scented with nutmeg from a candle. Thomas's cap still hung by the door, as it always had. I wanted the house to look exactly as it should, not defensive, not desperate, just dignified. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Ellen holding a folder and David standing slightly behind her, composed but cautious. "Thank you for meeting with us," she said, her tone smooth, practiced. "We want to resolve things peacefully." I smiled faintly. "Peacefully," I said, "is a good word. Let's see if the facts agree with it." They followed me to the table and sat across from me. For a moment, we were 3 silhouettes divided by sunlight and paper. I began without preface. "Your letters say this house and the joint account fall under your father's estate. You are mistaken." I opened the first folder and slid it toward them, the bank statement, notarized and sealed by Harold. "Your father made me the sole beneficiary 2 years before he passed." The bank confirmed it. David took the paper and read in silence, his lawyer's eyes scanning for flaws. Ellen stayed still, her jaw set. I opened the second folder, the county deed, stamped by the clerk. "Your father and I jointly owned this property. His half transferred to me automatically upon his death." Ellen shifted, her composure thinning. "That can't be right," she said. "Dad always said the house was family property." "And I am family," I replied softly. "By law and by the promises he made." David cleared his throat. "You know Ellen doesn't mean harm," he said. "She's trying to keep her father's legacy intact." I met his gaze. "A legacy isn't an address. It's how you treat the people inside it." I opened the final folder, the insurance document, the one that started it all. "This is the policy your father updated a year before his stroke. He removed all secondary beneficiaries and left a note for the agent. You can read it." I slid it across the table. The note was brief, written in Thomas's square handwriting. "For Marion, because home is who waited." Ellen stared at the line, her expression cracking, not from anger, but from disbelief. "He never showed me this," she whispered. "He didn't have to," I said gently. "He lived it." For a long while, no one spoke. The clock ticked, the tea steamed, and even the air seemed to listen. Finally, David folded his hands. "You've been thorough," he said. "I'll advise Ellen to withdraw the claim." She looked at him sharply, but he continued. "There's no legal ground left to stand on." Ellen looked at me, her eyes wet now but unyielding. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "I thought you took him from us." I shook my head. "I shared him with you. You just never looked closely enough to see it." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her voice caught somewhere between apology and pride. "We're done here," she said, finally standing. David rose beside her, gathering their papers. "You've built a strong case," he said with reluctant respect. "No case," I corrected softly. "Just truth with witnesses." As they turned to leave, Ellen paused at the doorway, her voice almost breaking. "He really loved you," she said. "He did," I replied. "And he taught me to love this family, even when it didn't love me back." She nodded once, the faintest gesture of surrender, and walked out. I waited until I heard the car start before I sat down again. My hands trembled slightly as I stacked the folders back together. The sunlight had shifted, landing on Thomas's cap by the door. I whispered, "We kept our promise, my love." Calmly, just like you taught me. Later that evening, I called Harold. "It's done," I said. He didn't ask for details. "Then let peace file the rest," he answered. Grace came by with a pie, and we ate it without ceremony. "How did it go?" she asked. "Quietly," I said. Truth doesn't need volume. When night fell, I walked through the house slowly, touching the door frames, the windowsills, the life I had defended not through battle but through order. I wrote one final line in the belonging ledger. Justice, when spoken softly, still echoes. The following week passed, like the quiet after a storm, the air still charged, but clean. I woke each morning to the same sound of ferries crossing the bay and the same creak in the floor by the window. But everything felt steadier now, as if the house itself knew it had been defended with dignity. 3 days after the meeting, I received an envelope from Frost and Landon. My heart hesitated as I opened it, expecting another demand. Instead, it was a withdrawal notice. The legal claim on the property had been rescinded. A single line at the bottom read, "Case closed by mutual resolution." I traced the words with my thumb and exhaled slowly. Peace rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives on official paper and a deep breath. That afternoon, I walked to the garden, pruning the roses Thomas had planted the year we married. The soil was cold but rich, the buds stubbornly reaching for light. Grace joined me with gloves and her easy laughter. "So," she said, "how does it feel to win?" I smiled. "It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like balance being restored." She nodded, understanding without needing more words. Later that evening, I called Harold to thank him. "No thanks needed," he said. "The law just caught up to your integrity." I laughed softly. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's the only way that matters," he replied. "What will you do now?" "Keep living," I said. "And maybe repaint the kitchen." He chuckled. "Good. Justice should always end with color." A week later, a letter arrived from Ellen. Her handwriting was smaller than before, careful and unsure. She wrote, "Mom, I owe you more than I can say. I thought protecting my father's legacy meant holding on to what was his. I never saw that his legacy was you. I was wrong. At the bottom," she added, "I hope we can start again, even if it's slower this time." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer where Thomas's watch lay. I didn't respond immediately. Some forgiveness takes shape in silence before it finds words. 2 weeks later, Ellen came to visit. She stood on the porch like someone returning to an old church. I opened the door and said, "Come in, Ellen." She stepped inside, looking around as if seeing the house for the first time. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "It's exactly the same. Only your heart grew enough to notice the space." We sat in the kitchen, sharing tea in the cups Thomas and I used for guests. "I've spoken with David," she said. "We're setting up a scholarship in Dad's name at the local high school, for students who plan to study library science." I smiled, surprised. He would have liked that. "I know," she said. "I hope you'll help choose the first recipient." I nodded, gladly. When she left, she hugged me briefly, awkwardly, but real. "You deserved better from me," she said. "We both deserved truth sooner," I answered. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just said, "Thank you for holding your ground." "It's what the house taught me," I said. "You build things to last." That night, as I sat by the window watching the lights shimmer on the bay, I felt a strange mix of pride and humility. I hadn't set out to win a battle. I'd set out to keep a promise to Thomas, to myself, and even, in a way, to Ellen. The promise that love without boundaries turns fragile, but love with truth becomes permanent. The next morning, I began tending to the small patch of earth near the back fence, the one Thomas used to call the stubborn garden. I planted new roses there, red and pale gold, the colors he liked best. As I pressed the soil around the roots, I whispered, "It's done, love. Everything is where it belongs." That evening, Grace came by again with dinner. We ate while the sun sank behind the trees. "You know," she said, "not many people could have stayed as calm as you did." I smiled. "Calm isn't weakness, it's just courage in a quieter form." She raised her glass. "To quiet courage. To family that learns," I said. Before going to bed, I opened the belonging ledger one last time. I turned to the final blank page and wrote, February 12. Peace finalized, not by argument, but by understanding. Then I closed it for good and placed it on the shelf beside Thomas's favorite books. The ferries outside glided across the dark water, and for the first time in months, the sound felt like a lullaby again. 3 months later, spring returned to Port Orchard. The bay shimmered with that silver light Thomas used to call forgiving weather, and the tulips by the fence had opened in careful rows. I sat on the porch that morning with a cup of tea, the air smelling of salt and lilac. Life had settled back into a rhythm, quiet, deliberate, honest. Ellen came every Sunday now. Sometimes she brought her husband, sometimes just herself. We no longer spoke about the house or the papers. Those belonged to another season of our lives. Instead, we talked about her work, the garden, and small things like which ferry ran faster across the bay. Each visit ended with her hugging me a little longer, as if trust needed time to learn the shape of us again. The scholarship she created in Thomas's name became real faster than I expected. The first recipient was a girl from the local high school who wanted to become a librarian. At the ceremony, Ellen asked me to hand out the award. "You're the reason this exists," she said quietly as I handed the envelope to the student. For a moment, I saw something new in her eyes, not guilt, not pity, but pride. That night, when I came home, I placed the program from the ceremony in the belonging ledger. I hadn't planned to open it again, but the empty space at the end seemed to invite one last entry. I wrote, "Peace requires proof. Proof requires patience. Both, together, build home." Then I closed it and slid it onto the shelf between Thomas's gardening guides and the poetry books he used to read aloud. The next morning, I walked to the bluff overlooking the water. The wind moved gently through the trees, and the ferries crossed the bay like they always had, unhurried, unbothered, faithful. I whispered into the air, "We're all part of the family now, Thomas, just as you hoped." I turned back toward the house, its windows warm with morning light, and smiled. Some walls don't divide, they teach. Thanks for listening. Share your story in the comments, your voice matters.